This is the working hour. It's Wednesday again. Hope everyone had a wonderful 4th of July. I had a working one actually. If you saw my little quick stream yesterday, it actually was a working one, but I did kind of cut it off at like 3 o'clock and then just spent some time with the family and did some stuff at home. It's funny, I live by the beach, but didn't go to the beach, but a lot of people did. Traffic was really bad. So, yeah, so that was kind of what my day was yesterday. But let's get into the thick of things and let's talk about the two things that I wanted to talk about today. So the first is going to be actually about leadership. And then the second thing is going to be about how it is that when you get higher up in your career, the longer it takes for you to find your next opportunity. And that's why there needs to be some planning around it and why you need to not just kind of roll up and just kind of see how it comes. Um, so why don't we start with our first topic? And the first topic is actually on leadership and actually what I think is a master class in leadership from the owner of the New York Mets, Steve Cohen. So I don't know if you guys may not realize this. I am a native New Yorker, born and raised. I live in California now. Um, can't just can't root for the Dodgers. I'm sorry. I'll root for them if I go and they're not playing the Mets. I'm okay with that. Um, but there's a whole family history with that about them leaving Brooklyn, and that we just don't talk about that. Um, but I don't know how familiar you are if you watch baseball or not, but if you do, you'll know that the New York Mets have the highest payroll in baseball. And for the longest time, the Mets were underinvested in. And this was supposed to be one of those years where the Mets were going to do some great things. And if you kind of look at kind of what kind of the play that's going on the field and stuff like that. The Mets are in like fourth place. They're, I mean, they're under 500 by a lot. So they're not even, they've lost more games than they've won. And then on top of that, there's all this expectation. So in typical New York fashion, uh, you know, people have been screaming for people's heads. It's like, you need to fire the coach. You need to fire the GM. You need to do this. And this is why I believe this is a master class in leadership by the Mets owner. Now, again, this man has invested, him and his wife, because his wife is his partner. Let's be clear on that. He and his wife have invested so much money into the club when it comes to player salaries that they are at the highest luxury tax bracket for Major League Baseball. And they actually have named this bracket after Steve Cohen, and they call it the Cohen bracket. Great, fantastic, right? Um, Here's a man who's got a lot invested. I mean, he's got a lot invested in this. And when asked and kind of pushed by the press in New York, um, he actually made this statement. And he made this last Wednesday when the Mets really, really they were not doing well. Now, the last 3 games they've won, so hopefully this is a sign of, you know, good things to come and everything. But this is why I believe this is a masterclass in leadership, because he had shown some leadership in the sense that he made a statement when he bought the club a few years ago that within 3 to 5 years they would be a championship in you know for the Mets. And if you look at where they are now, If they make the playoffs, it'll be amazing. Oddly enough to call the amazing Mets, but it would be amazing if they just made the playoffs, and hopefully they do. With that said, he made this statement last Wednesday, and I'm actually going to read it to you. And Steve Cohen said during a press conference, I am a patient guy. Okay. Everyone wants a headline. Everyone says, fire this person, fire that person. But I don't see that as a way to operate. Now, here's the master class in leadership. And if you are a business owner, if you are a manager, supervisor, CEO, CFO, or anything like that, these next words from a man who runs a multi billion dollar enterprise, not just the team, but also his hedge fund, but the team alone, multi billion dollar enterprise. He says this: if you want to attract good people to this organization, the worst thing you can do is be impulsive and win the headline for the day. Overall, over time, you're not going to attract the best talent. You're not going to want to work for somebody who has a short fuse. Listen, I know fans, they want something to happen. I get it. But sometimes you can't do it because you have long term objectives. Sit with that for a second. Don't want to work for somebody who has a short fuse. If you do rash things, you're not going to attract the best talent. And sometimes you need to look at the long term as opposed to the short term. Like I said, a masterclass in leadership. I thought it was fantastic. I actually wrote about it on Saturday, which, if you are interested in sports at all, you know it is Bobby Bonilla Day. And again, it's, if you want, go actually read my post in LinkedIn about Bobby Bonilla Day. It was back on Saturday. It's hilarious, because the Mets are going to be paying this gentleman who is 60 years old right now for the next 12 years, almost $2 million a year. They've already paid him 13. Um, they've already paid him for the last 13 years. Um, one almost $1.2 million. Um, but yeah, again, go check that out and catch that out. Now, now let's get into the meat of kind of what I want to talk about, and kind of usually what I do, and what I want to use this time for, historically. And that's kind of talking about my most recent blog post and kind of what's out there. And it kind of ties in a little bit. Um, but it's about this. Now, I don't know if you realized, as you kind of go up in your career, it seems that the higher you go, the longer it takes to find that next opportunity, that next position. It doesn't matter if you are unemployed and looking for your next gig, or if you're employed and you just need to get out and you're looking for something new. Um, but it typically takes longer the higher up you go, and there's a valid reason for it. But let's dive into it a little bit deeper during this call. So why don't we start off? And again, you know, I think everyone needs to probably understands that the hiring process for managers and supervisors, any kind of leadership position in an organization, is really essential. It's essential that the company kind of gets it right, because there's a lot riding on it. And you can say a single person can't bring down a company, but in certain cases they can. And there's again, there's examples in history about a single person bringing down a company. Um, how many people have heard of Barron's Bank? Um, Probably most of the people on this stream have never heard of it. But they're no longer because one rogue trader brought the bank down, a financial institution that had been in business for hundreds of years. So getting these roles correct and getting the right people in the right positions is really crucial to the company's success. And it can be a very time consuming process. And I know this from personal experience. I've worked in HR for my whole professional career. I've been responsible for hiring these positions, and you know the length of the hiring process can actually vary depending upon various factors, depending upon the position level, the industry, and again the process for the company. Now, on average, it's going to take hiring managers and supervisors anywhere to hire somebody. It's going to take usually on the short end 30 days. That's if the stars and everything line up and everything. But the truth of the matter, it's more like 60 to 90 days from the start of the process all the way through. Now, a lot depends on the complexity of the role and kind of what's going on. And like I said, these are very important positions. So it can take several months to do this. So if you're in the middle of a process right now where you're interviewing for a job and you're wondering why is it taking so long for them to make a decision? I interviewed already. You might have a couple more interviews coming. Don't be surprised. And don't be surprised that from the time you've applied to the time you're actually sitting in the chair, several months can pass. So one reason for extending the hiring process is that companies want to ensure that they are selecting the best candidate for the role. Now, again, selecting the wrong person can have negative consequences in the company's performance. Therefore, companies may conduct multiple interviews, background checks, reference checks, ensuring that the candidate has the necessary skills and experience for the position. I know I've worked in the oil and gas industry. I've worked and lived in Houston, Texas, and I've worked overseas in the oil and gas industry. Again, in that industry, as big as it is, it's still a very tight knit community. And it's not uncommon for people to know other people who work for other companies. And it's not uncommon. And as an HR person, I would hate when this happened where a manager would call a buddy up in another company and say, "Hey, do you know about XYZ person?" And this happens. As much as we'd like to try to avoid those kinds of calls and have it go through a formal process, there's a certain liability that kind of falls into that, but it happens. Partly because they feel that there's a lot riding on making sure that they have the right person in the right job because again, you know, it has to do not only with company performance, but also with safety for the people who are working there too. So that's first and foremost. The other thing is, you know, it can involve posting jobs on job boards and connecting with recruiting agencies and conducting outreach to potential candidates on social media. That in of itself can take some time just to review applicants. And I know for some of the positions that I used to recruit for when I was a recruiter, when I was a headhunter, um, you know, again, I'm old enough and I've been in this game long enough where I used to place ads in the New York Times to get people to send their resumes and send them in via fax and later on via email to me, um, just as the job boards were starting to get out there. And yes, that people actually looked at want ads, and there was actually a skill on how to write a help wanted ad and have it in the newspaper. Skill nobody needs anymore. But I digress, and again, that's another story for another time. But the sheer number of resumes that come in to an organization, you cannot comprehend. And what happens a lot of times is that people will send in resumes for positions that they're not qualified for. And it still requires a recruiter or somebody to put eyes on it and look at it and say, oh, okay, this person has qualifications. The other thing is, if you do use technology to sort through and to do that, um, sometimes people write some really bad resumes. And I've seen some really bad resumes on some very talented and qualified people. It's not their zone of genius to write a resume, but if somebody didn't look at it, it may get overlooked. And a lot of times these days they do get overlooked because it's the path of least resistance. So it's important that you do get your resume squared away and taken care of. Um, the other thing is when you're hiring for a managerial or supervisory position, these roles also require some specific skills, some leadership skills, how to manage a team effectively, and therefore the companies need to evaluate candidates based on that. And unfortunately, a lot of times what ends up happening is people end up in roles where they not have not been trained for. We don't necessarily train people to be managers. Now, some very forward-looking companies have programs in place where they start to develop their leadership teams, and they start to build a pipeline, and they start to build that capability within house. And what I always love to do is challenge my managers and say, who do you have internally that can maybe move into this role? I'd always want to get my promotions out of the way first and then try to backfill a lower level position. Uh, A, because it just was easier to do. And it also was good for the company to promote people internally. But getting those leadership skills, and because so much hangs on it, it's really important to make sure that you can find people who have those skills, who can show up as a leader, manage a team effectively, keep their eye on their budgets and keep their eye on kind of what's going on, and to be able to delegate out. Now, a lot of times, people who do move up, especially when they start out as being new managers, the delegation part kind of goes away, and they just don't have that skill, and it's something that needs to be taught, and they need to learn again for their individual success. So, again, this takes time, and because there is so much weighing on it, there's there's that. The other thing is this: you have to look at leadership like a pyramid, right? So what ends up happening is the higher you go in your career, the fewer number of positions, right? There's usually one CEO, one president, a few executive vice presidents, maybe a few vice presidents, a few directors, a bunch of managers, and then people doing work down below at various levels. And even in those various levels, you're not going to have a ton of senior people. You're going to have a mix of more junior people and more experienced people. Uh, just because you need to make sure that you have a pipeline of people, that as people start to retire, as people start to move on and go to different places, that you don't have a gap in your skill set. And I'll use the oil and gas industry again as another example. Um, Back in the 80s, I don't know if you know this or anything, but back in the 80s, the price of oil dropped dramatically. And as a result of the price of oil dropping, what ended up happening was the oil and gas companies had to lay off people in the late 80s and early 90s. And for almost the whole generation, did not really hire. They did not go to the universities. They did not engage with them and do anything because they really didn't have any openings to fill. And what ended up happening in the mid 2000s is those people who got those jobs in the 80s and in the 90s and who were there and may have gotten their jobs, even in the 70s, they were starting to come to retirement age and have had these long careers. And as a result, there was a skill gap because there were not people coming up behind them to fill in those lower level positions. So now, as people were starting to fall off and retire, do other things, whatever it was, all of a sudden you had very junior people who were early on their career. You had senior people that were at the end of their career and were very experienced, but you had nothing in the middle. And that caused some issues and that has caused some problems. A lot of that has kind of worked itself out now. But for a while there, it was a big, big issue. And I know from when I was doing hiring in the industry, it was a huge issue because one of the things that was the biggest fear in the organizations I worked in was that were we going to be able to get people to up to speed to take those positions where we would not have a skills gap or knowledge gap, where we would lose that institutional knowledge. And took great pains to make sure that people got the experience that they needed to go into leadership roles. So, again, if you're out there and you're kind of struggling with looking for a new opportunity and looking for things like that, and you're a manager and you're up in your career, there's a reason for it. And don't fret, stay tough. Understand that it's going to be one of those things where it may take a little bit of time. Um, one of the things that I've gone and I've done it recently is I actually did a master class a few weeks ago, a little webinar and stuff like that. And I talked about the three things you need to do to prepare for a possible job change or a possible layoff. You can go if you scan the code right over here. Um, you can actually go and view that and take a look at it. There's some really great information. One of the things I talk about is actually making sure that you have your finances in order, making sure you have a plan and making sure that you have your resume in order. Um, and we go into detail on what that looks like and everything, but definitely check it out, see what it's all about and everything. Um, again, information, knowledge is power. So make sure that you have that. The other thing is, if you want to check out my website, you can do so up here. Whoa, up here. Just scan that code, and you can actually get onto my website, see a little bit more about me, what I do, what I've done in the past. There's links to um, my podcast and my blog and everything like that. You can see past blog entries and everything. But definitely go check it out and stuff. And then the other thing is that I'm really excited about and that I've been working kind of hard the last few weeks on has been a program that I put together that I call the Hiring Season Essentials. And when I was recruiting and when I was hiring people for these, billion-dollar organizations, there were two times of the season or two times of the year where we did had big pushes for hiring. The first was the beginning of the year, but the second time was right after the summertime, right in about August time frame, um, maybe just before Labor Day time, where there was a big push to get positions filled. And a lot of times, what ended up happening was managers would be challenged to say, "Hey, do you still need these positions?" because we may need to free up budget money to put someplace else where we may have run over, or we may need to put resources elsewhere. And they're going to get pushed on that. The other thing is if they don't fill those positions, it affects their budgets for next year, which they should be just finishing up shortly and kind of putting to bed. And if they don't fill the positions that they have this year, it's going to affect the positions they have next year as well. So for them, it's kind of like a mad rush to kind of get positions filled. So for you, if you're looking for another opportunity, if you're looking to get out of where you are now, or if you are already have left and you're looking for that next opportunity, it's really important for you to go and to get your ducks in a row. And again, I call it the hiring season essentials. If you scan, you can find out more there. It's three things that I focus in on: resume, because I can't tell you how many times and how many people get it wrong. They think they have the right things in there, but they just don't. The other thing is strategy. Can't tell you how many people just roll on up and just paper the town without any kind of strategy or any kind of focus on what they're doing. And then the last part of it is interviewing. And I can't stress enough. What I tell my one on one clients is this: if you get an interview, congratulations, you got the job, because on paper they liked what they saw. The resume did its job, it got you the interview. But the truth of the matter is that as much as you got the job on paper, now they're going to figure out and they're going to try to see if you're going to be a fit for the organization, if what you have on paper is actually true. And you need to be prepared. You just can't, again, roll up and then not be prepared. They're going to ask you some questions, and they're going to ask you some difficult questions. And one of the favorite questions I used to ask was, tell me a time when you failed at something. Now, think about that one. Nobody wants to talk about failure, especially during a job interview. And there was a reason why I used to ask that question. If you want to find out why I asked that question and how to answer that question, you need to go and you need to take this class. Because again, your next opportunity, the success of you landing that next opportunity may hinge on you executing a good resume, a good strategy, and nailing that interview. So that's the end of this week. We're coming to my half hour. I try to keep this at a half hour. Next week, what we're going to do is I'm going to have I'm going to say, I'm keeping my fingers crossed, a special guest. We're going to talk a little bit more about leadership because, again, this person is a subject matter expert on leadership, and look to see you next week. So have a great day, great rest of your week. And again, hopefully you're getting back into the hustle of the day.